Hello and welcome to episode 390 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Andy, and we are doing a throwback episode this week. So just a little bit behind the curtain, Andy and I have been off this week at the same time, seeing our own families. It's half term after all. In the past, what we've done is usually just left a blank episode. We just missed an episode and you guys would cry into your coffees on a Sunday morning and write to us and ask where the episode is. But what we're doing these days are doing throwback episodes when we have a gap, where we look at past content, update it, and also add new content to it as well. So that's one of these episodes. But before I talk about what the podcast is about this week, including the new content we're doing, Andy, you just want to read out a quick review that we got via email. And before Andy reads it out, don't forget, please send in your reviews if you enjoy the podcast, because it really does help motivate the team. It's always good to hear what you think about the show, ways we can improve if possible. And also, if you leave a review on your app of choice that you use to listen to the podcast, it helps us move up those charts.
Yeah, so Louise got in touch to say thank you so much for not only the podcast, but also the Money MOT series of emails. So if you don't know what that is, make sure you go to the Money to the Masses homepage and there's a Money MOT button right in the top right hand corner, and you can do your own Money MOT, which in just 2 minutes answer a few questions. You'll be able to see how you stack up in terms of your finances compared to everyone else who has done that, and it gives you a grading score A to E, and if you want to, you can put your email address in there and it will give you a tailored list of recommendations of things that you need to do to improve your score. So make sure you do that if you haven't already. And so Louise goes on, I'm especially appreciative of the tone you use in your communications in those emails, and you're not permanently trying to ram affiliated products and services down my throat. And that's great to hear, because that's not what we do here at Money to the Masses. Not having much experience in managing my finances, this whole subject felt like a where to start area in my life. And the way that you've presented yourself and your ideas has really helped me to start my own money conversations and research into my finances and how I want to manage them. I like how you present your information as a point to consider and encourage analytical thinking rather than a prescribed method to follow or else. Keep up the good work, Louise. So that was great to hear.
Yeah, and I love the comments about the tone, because we always try and keep the tone consistent in that way of trying to encourage people to think analytically, because the best way to get people to improve their finances and to learn more about money and investing and all the other topics of personal finance is to spark that interest, so they start to get that hunger, that thirst to try and learn more. And if you do that, then you just set the wheels in motion and they will start to learn and research things themselves, which is always what I've tried to achieve with Money to Masses. So I love the fact that Louise has mentioned that we managed to do that. So that's made my day. Right, moving on to what we're going to talk about this week on the podcast. So we are supposedly heading towards a recession, according to the Bank of England, and it seems to be a bit of a consensus view at the moment. In that scenario, then the reality is that we are going to be facing redundancies, and the unemployment rate is expected to increase throughout 2023 into 2024. Now, these things can obviously change, but as we started to do with the podcast, we're trying to prepare people for the world that's coming. And one of the things that is unfortunately going to happen to a number of listeners is that they will be made redundant. So what we've done is we've gone back to 2020 and we did a podcast episode 278 where we talked about redundancy in your rights. So we will be including that in this show and playing that whole piece through, but we're also getting Harvey onto the show this week to talk about redundancy insurance. So insurances that you can take out that can help you if you unfortunately are made redundant. And that's something we've never covered before on the Money to the Masses podcast.
Okay, so let's play back that piece then. It's only a short piece from 2020 that talks about your rights and also the procedures under UK law that your employer must follow. So let's play that piece out now and we'll see you on the other side.
I wanted to run through some information on redundancy and the procedures to inform people. But what I want to also say is if you listen to this piece and it is relevant to you, do go and look at the article on the Money to the Masses website, so the podcast article for this show, and we will link through to a couple of pieces that are very good. One of them was done by Which, one is the official .gov.uk website that has a lot of information on the rules and regulations around redundancy, and we've pulled together some of that for this piece. So I'm going to start just to crack through this. So employers have to follow procedures by employment law when they make people redundant. The first thing they should do is they should notify you that you're at risk of redundancy. Now, if they're reducing the numbers of staff in a particular role, then they have to identify a suitable pool of people to choose from who they will make redundant. And they have to use fair criteria in which to do that. And then they have to consult with each employee and consult with trade union and staff representatives if there's more than 20 people being made redundant. So if you haven't heard anything and you are suddenly made redundant, then it's likely that your employer has breached employment rules. The other thing is that your employer has to give you a full explanation as why you've been selected for redundancy. So they can use a number of methods. Things like last in, first out can be one method, but it can't be discriminatory. So if you take a scenario where maybe the last people in all belong to a particular demographic, let's say they happen to be all the young people within a firm, then you could argue it's starting to discriminate against a certain subset of the company, and they could open themselves up for being challenged on that. They can take methods such as volunteers. They could ask people who want to be made redundant, which they call self-selection. It could be based on disciplinary records or appraisals, skills, qualifications, and experience. Now, your employer can, in fact, make you redundant without following a selection process if your job no longer exists. For example, you might be the only employee in a certain part of the organisation where you work. The thing to remember, you can appeal if you feel you've been unfairly selected for whatever reason. And you have to write to your employer explaining the reasons why you think it's unfair. You might be asked to reapply for your own job, which is very common. I know people who are having to do that, unfortunately. But one thing people must bear in mind, if you do not apply for a job or you're unsuccessful in your application, you still technically have a job until your employer makes you redundant. So you're not redundant at the point that you don't get the job or you don't apply. They have to actually make you redundant. Now, there are a number of reasons that would automatically be deemed unfair if they were used as a reason for selection for redundancy. So if you were pregnant or you being on maternity or paternity leave was used as a selection process on the grounds of sex, race, sexual orientation, disability, or whistleblowing. So there's a whole list of these that if they were used as a selection criteria, they would automatically be deemed unfair. Now, you can apply to a court for compensation if you think you were dismissed unfairly or not consulted properly as part of your redundancy. So you can see there's a recurring theme here. There are rights, if you're going to be made redundant, that employers have to respect and procedures which they have to follow. And so you need to make yourself fully aware of them. Like I said, we're going to link through to the article so you can read them in detail. Now, you can make a claim to the employment tribunal if you were unfairly dismissed, and you can get a basic reward for that. Or if there was no consultation about your redundancy, there's something called a protective award, which is slightly different. So one of the things people will automatically want to know next is the notice period. Now, the notice period can vary depending on your own contract, but there are statutory minimum notice periods in England, Wales and Scotland, and it's 1 week if you've been with the company for between 1 month and 2 years. For those employed for between 2 and 12 years, it's a week for each year of employment, and if you've been employed for 12 years or over, it's 12 weeks. Of course, your employer could offer suitable alternative employment. Now, you do have the right to refuse an offer of alternative employment. So that might be within your organisation. They say there's another job over here which they believe that you could do and would offer you that. However, if you unreasonably refuse an offer of a suitable employment, it could mean that you miss out on statutory redundancy pay. So you have to bear that in mind. So as much as the employer has to keep up their side of the bargain, there are certain rules and procedures you have to be aware of, and you have to be aware of how your actions could have implications for you when it comes to your statutory redundancy pay. Of course, if your employer has suitable alternative employment and they don't offer it to you, then your redundancy could be deemed unfair. Now, when it comes to redundancy packages, that again can depend on lots of things, including your contract. But everybody who's been within the business for 2 years or more is usually entitled to statutory redundancy, which is worked out on how long you've worked at the organisation up to a maximum of 20 years and your age. So there's a banding that goes on. If you're aged between 18 and 22, your redundancy pay per 4 years' work. It's half a week's pay. If you're between 22 and 40, it's 1 week's pay. If you're 41 and older, it's 1.5 weeks' pay. Now, there is a weekly pay cap at £538, with the maximum amount of statutory redundancy pay capped at £16,140. Now, these things can change if you're listening to this in the future, so do go and look at those links and you can find out more. Now, you are still entitled to any holiday pay, commission and bonuses you are owed, and these payments will be subject to tax. The rest of your redundancy package, whether it's statutory or extra, will not be taxed up to £30,000. Now, in terms of payment, your redundancy should be paid on the date that you leave the company or your next normal payday. So you need to find out what they are. Now, there are rules, which I'm not going to go into on the podcast, about what you should do if there's something goes wrong with your payment. But as I say, you can find all the information on the article via the links. But one thing I want to quickly point out is if your employer is made insolvent, then you have different rights depending on whether your employer makes you redundant, asks you to keep working, or transfers your work to a new employer. But one thing that's worth pointing out, that if your company is made insolvent, then all's not lost, because it can be possible to claim redundancy payment from the government. So a slightly depressing piece to put on the podcast, but hopefully it's an FYI to people out there to understand the basics, but also to know where to look for more information.
Okay, so before we now move on to the piece where Harvey is going to be talking about redundancy insurance, let me just quickly clarify a couple of numbers there that Damien did mention do change over time. The weekly pay cap that you'll have with statutory redundancy has gone from £538 up to £571. So that's the maximum amount weekly that you could get on statutory redundancy. And the maximum total amount of statutory redundancy pay has increased from £16,140 and it is now £17,130. So that number does increase each year, but everything else that we mentioned in that particular part of the podcast is as it was. So let's bring Harvey onto the show then, who's going to talk about the things that we can do if we're worried about redundancy and unemployment, because there are insurance products out there that protect us. So Harvey, welcome back to the show. Redundancy and unemployment cover then. Unfortunately, it is one of those things that we're seeing in the press a little more now, as unemployment figures are rising and are predicted to rise more in the future. So where do we start then? What is this redundancy cover? How do you buy it?
Hi, Andy. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It is important that we understand that, this is largely stemming from the fact that businesses need to make cuts to overheads. And one of the largest outlays that any business has is its payroll. And a lot of people might be finding that in situations where they can see that their business might be looking to make some redundancies as part of a cost-cutting measure. Redundancy insurance generally is for people to protect their incomes against something that they don't know about that's unpredictable happening to their job in the future. And that's the key focus of us explaining redundancy insurance, is so that our listeners can understand exactly what it will cover, what it won't cover, and in what circumstances it's best to buy.
Okay, so you kind of alluded to it there. This is an insurance product that people can take in the unlikely event that they may become redundant. And so I imagine it's not a type of policy that's available to people who perhaps are near the top of the list in terms of getting made redundant, or maybe there's a big company that's in the press, there's news of big redundancies about to happen. I take it it's kind of too late for those kind of people, unfortunately.
It is, and that's where we want to be straight with our listeners, is if you are in a situation where you know of redundancies that are coming, perhaps your industry is under redundancy notice, or your company has announced that it will shortly be making redundancies, in those circumstances, you would not qualify for redundancy insurance policy that protects you against that. You would have had to have had that kind of insurance in place already prior to that kind of notification. And that means rumours as well. I mean, it's slightly difficult to work out how insurance companies would work out whether you'd picked up a rumour that was going around your employer. But largely, if you know about a redundancy coming your way, then you won't be paid out in redundancy cover policy. And that's that's the best way to approach it. So it's there, and it's there for people who might just generally be worried about the state of the economy, the state of employment in the country, people that have perhaps mortgage payments and want to ensure that in the worst case scenarios, their mortgage payments are going to be made if they face redundancy. Redundancy, unlike sickness, is a situation that most people can grapple with. So if you're made redundant, chances are you're going to be able to go and find another job. It might take some time and you might need some help during that period of time, but largely it's a situation that's within your control, unlike the flip side of redundancy insurance, because redundancy insurance often comes hand in hand with sickness cover, and sickness is something that's slightly outside of your control. So if you're sick and you're unwell, then there's little you're going to be able to do about that. But redundancy, on the other hand, is a situation that might be only a short-term obstacle to paying your normal bills.
Okay, so I'm in a situation, let's imagine, where I'm in an industry that's relatively safe. I've heard no rumours within my organisation that there's any redundancies happening, but I'm someone who's got a young family and wants to ensure that I've got something in place should the worst happen and I get made redundant. So I've made that decision. How do I go about it? What's the process? And what is the product that I need to look for?
The product you're looking for is redundancy insurance. It's sometimes referred to as unemployment insurance. So they're largely the same thing. So they pay out if you're made redundant. Now, there's a couple of scenarios where, you wouldn't be paid. So you have to understand what you're undertaking when you take out this type of cover. This type of cover won't pay out if you knew about the redundancy. We've spoken about that. But also if you volunteer for redundancy. So in some situations, your employer might make redundancies available to those people who come forward and take redundancy. And in some cases they do. And that's a much nicer way for companies to take people off the payroll because they're willing and perhaps are nearing retirement or would benefit from the payout that they would get from either a statutory or a company redundancy payout. You also won't get a payout if you've refused an offer of alternative employment from your employer. So where your job is perhaps now redundant, but a similar job that you're qualified for has been offered to you and you've declined that, then that again might stop a redundancy insurance paying out to you. If you're dismissed due to misconduct or you just basically didn't pass your probationary period when you started employment, those might be quite sort of self-evident, but those situations again wouldn't result in a payout from a redundancy insurance policy. So before you go out and start buying these, just ensure that you're not expecting them to pay out for those kinds of scenarios. But largely you can find redundancy insurance with most specialist income protection brokers, so people that specialize in protecting your income. They'll have a good understanding of different occupations because what you do for a living can determine whether or not you can get redundancy covered and how much it will cost. They'll also be able to work around things like whether you want to tag some accident and sickness cover with your redundancy cover. So sometimes for people working in certain industries, redundancy cover might not be available on its own, but as soon as you tag it with some accident and sickness insurance, which is a part of the insurance that would pay out if you became unfit to work, so if you had an illness or you became injured, then the policy would be available to you. So there's a few different ways to arrange redundancy insurance, but the best way to buy it is to speak to a specialist who'll be able to point you in the right direction for the kind of policy that's best for you.
Okay, so are there any limitations in terms of the amount that this cover can pay out monthly and for how long it will continue to pay out for?
Yeah, I mean, it's largely based on what you earn. You can't expect redundancy insurance policies to pay you out what you're normally paid. They're generally a proportion of what you're paid. Sometimes between 50 and 60% of your gross income is a measure that's used by insurance companies in terms of what you can protect as a benefit. But when it comes to redundancy insurance, sometimes that measure is applied not to your earnings, but to your mortgage payment. So what it's looking to do is pay your mortgage amount each month until you're able to get back on your feet and back to work and back to earning an income. that allows you to do so. There could be a small uplift to the amount of the mortgage payment as well. So say your mortgage payment is £1,500, there may be a small uplift to that to allow for other associated payments that you're making, for example, for life insurance, critical illness insurance and things like that, so that you're able to cover a little bit more than what your mortgage payment is. But those are the two factors that an insurance company will use: your earnings or what you're paying for your mortgage each month.
Okay, so to finish off then, Harvey, what sort of information do people need and where do they go if they want to get a quote for this kind of thing? So I imagine the quotes are tailored to the individual based on lots of factors. What information do they need to provide?
It's fairly straightforward. You need your name, your age, what you do for a living is going to be quite key. Whether you're employed or self-employed people, unfortunately, will struggle to get redundancy insurance. But, it's always worth having a conversation with the experts before you write it off entirely. How much you earn a year and whether you're a homeowner. So if you're a homeowner, then generally your mortgage payment amount is something that will be relevant. If you choose to have accident and sickness within your cover, then you'll need some health information. So they might ask you things like, do you smoke? Have you had any health problems in the past couple of years? Are you on medication? Are you waiting any test investigations from a medical point of view? What amount of cover you ideally want? So have a little think about, what other income streams come into your house, whether your partner can cover some of your outgoings, what amount you would ideally want to cover. Because remember, ultimately, if you're not made redundant, you're not going to claim on this type of policy. So there's no sense in paying for more than what you need. So work that out. And ideally, when you'd like your cover to start, if you're worried about redundancy in general and you've got none of the, aforementioned reasons to believe that redundancy is genuinely coming your way, then it is better to put the policy in place sooner rather than later, because if that message then does come around, you may be too late to the game and miss out on being able to cover your income in that scenario.
Great. Well, what we're going to do is we'll put a link to an article that talks about the statutory side of redundancy, but also redundancy, unemployment insurance and all the details on there, including the details of an expert redundancy insurance broker who you can speak to and get some advice that's tailored to you, and also some quotes as well, so you can see how much it's going to cost. So thanks once again, Harvey, for coming back on. Damien, let's bring you back in then.
Okay, so that's it for this week. We will be back as normal next week. Please don't forget to review the show. Also, don't forget to join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/money to the masses, because there's a lot of great content in there. And also, don't forget to follow us on our social channels. So, Andy, that's it for now. Until next time.
Until next time.